Okay, so just a brief heads up for your formal assessment 4. So you have 1 hour, 2 sections, 30 minutes for the case study section, and 30 minutes for your essay, which you're going to get to choose. I'm going to briefly go through the questions. Don't forget to use the case study. Even though I've gone through the questions, there is a lot of specific details in there. The first question says, with reference to figure 2, so use the data that's in figure 2. You're looking for specific figures for the Gini. It says describe what has happened to income inequality, so you need to say whether it has increased or decreased. You need to draw a Lorenz curve, and once you've drawn that Lorenz curve, show whether or not income inequality has got worse or better. Second question, 8 marks, assess question. So this is two-sided. Implications, so similar to impacts or consequences for the Russian economy. So Russia is our application of its dependence on oil and gas, so primary dependence. What you need is positive impact of this, and more obviously the negative impact of primary dependency. If you have a look at the data tables, it shows you fluctuating prices, but also within the case study it gives you some examples of benefits and costs of primary dependency. You don't need a conclusion because it's only an assess question, so be careful not to start saying it depends on, or trying to solve it, or talking about how if you move away from primary dependency to secondary, that's you're starting to do a conclusion or an evaluation there. The last question in the case study section, evaluate. So this time it is 2 sides plus a judgment. The likely benefits, so again positive and negative, for Russia of its decision to join the WTO. Again, there are some specific examples in the case study of what that means for Russia in terms of reductions in tariffs. What you are thinking of broadly is benefits to exporters of the joining and the negatives of imports from the same thing. The judgment would be looking at the extent to which the benefits and the type of industry that is gained from exports is greater than the losses from the imports. You could talk about or use the theory of comparative advantage to talk about a more efficient economy based on free trade. You could also talk about time, in that there may be some transition needed in the economy between one sector and another. Okay, I am going to focus on the first question, but if you choose to go for the second question, which is around reducing a fiscal deficit, just think about demand and supply side factors in terms of what you are cutting and what you are raising in terms of taxes, so things that affect aggregate demand, aggregate supply. So the question is looking at factors which increase a country's international competitiveness, and you are broadly looking at something which is micro and something which is macro, and international competitiveness being lower priced exports or better quality exports. any factors that you choose to explain will also need to be evaluated. So if you are looking at a factor which increases international competitiveness, you then also don't need to look at why the same factor might not. It's thinking about the extent to which this would lead to an increase in international competitiveness. So one example could be in micro, you could look at markets going from a monopoly to a more competitive market structure and linking that to productive efficiency or dynamic efficiency, and the productive efficiency meaning that there is lower prices due to economies of scale, and the dynamic efficiency leading to new and better quality products. And you would use the change from the monopoly to the monopolistically competitive graph to show that prices are falling and the business is becoming more competitive. You could evaluate that in two ways. One of them may be that price rises maybe aren't passed on, that they are kept in profits, or that a monopoly may gain greater economies of scale due to their size. So it may be that international monopolies that are already competing internationally are more productively efficient than domestically or UK markets which are competitive. In terms of macro, you could look at policies, so monetary policy or fiscal policy, which would encourage investment, so lower interest rates or incentives in terms of tax and subsidies, and they would lower cost of production for businesses on a short run aggregate supply level, or they would allow increases or a shift outwards in long run aggregate supply. And both of those, if it's specifically investment, could be used to explain why there would be a lower price exports or better quality exports. In terms of evaluating the fiscal and monetary policy, you could look at the extent to which other countries might copy. So for example, lower interest rates may just increase competitive interest rate reductions globally. It could be that subsidies are not permissible due to trade agreements, so within EU state aid, if you're part of the EU as we currently are, but also within some of WTO agreements. And again, corporation tax reductions may again be matched globally, so the incentive to invest within the UK rather than elsewhere might be diminished. In terms of how you would judge this, so you could look at the extent to which you could evaluate which causes of international competitiveness are better than others. So things which are structural or happen on the supply side of the economy tend to be long term, they tend to be permanent, and they are harder to copy. Things which are cyclical or on the demand side of the economy, so for example a weaker exchange rate or fiscal and monetary policies, tend to be shorter term and are easier to copy. You could also compare policies which have the same effect, so whether or not a reduction in interest rates is more or less effective than a reduction in corporation tax at increasing investment,